Hello, everybody, and welcome to the September Censorship Series program. My name is Mandy Sally. I am the Chief Operating Officer here at the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, and I'm really excited to welcome you back this month. We are going to be talking about book bans, not only that they are a problem and that they exist, but how have they been able to be so successful here in the United States over the last couple of years. I have two really brilliant panelists that you're going to meet in just a second. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion. But before we get started, I want to let you know to please feel free to make use of the Zoom chat during our discussion. You can ask questions, you can make comments. We want to hear from you and we want this to feel interactive. So please feel free to use that Zoom chat. I also want to let you know that this recording will be posted to Woodhull's YouTube page after we finish. So if you can't stay with us the whole time, don't fret. It will be there for you whenever you're ready to finish watching. So thanks again for being here. We do this censorship series every month. So we'll have a new topic in October, and I hope you will join us then as well. But without further ado, let's meet Robert and Nadine. All right. So, hello, good afternoon to both of you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to hear from you both today. And before we get really into the meat of our discussion and talking about book bans, I would love if you would just introduce yourselves to our audience, who you are, where you work. Tell us a little bit about your work. And Nadine, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Mandy. It is great to be here with you and Rob. My name is Nadine Fareed Johnson. I'm the Managing Director for Washington and Free Expression Programs at PEN America. PEN America is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the US and around the globe. My interest in censorship is rooted in the fact that I'm an attorney by training, a former professor of constitutional law, and I spent years as a US diplomat. And when I think about censorship, I think about the fundamental right to freedom of expression. And when that foundation falters, democracy is imperiled.
My name is Robert Boston. I am the editor of Church and State magazine, published by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Americans United is a national nonprofit organization that defends the right of everyone to believe or not, according to conscience, and upholds the idea of separation of church and state. We are opposed to any form of religiously based censorship, and that's an issue we've worked on for a long time, believing that people should have the right to read and explore all ideas without any sort of heavy-handed religious interference coming from religious groups or religious bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get into that because I think a lot of what's happening now has happened before. And the positive about that is that hopefully we can learn from that and learn how to fight against some, the censorship of books. But before we get into all of the nitty gritty about tactics and strategies that some of these book banners are using, let's set the stage a little bit for our audience. Nadine, you were one of the authors of PEN America's report on book bans, which I have to say I reference probably several times a week in my work here at Woodhull. So thank you so much. It's a wonderful resource for folks who have not had a chance to look at it. You definitely should. But can you just give us, that's a very long report, very detailed, but give us kind of a brief overview of the state of book bans, where we are right now in September 2023.
Thank you, Mandy, and thank you for referencing our reporting. We've been doing this now for a couple of years, and we have continued to see the book banning in this country rise exponentially. And I would actually couch it more broadly that we are really in the midst of one of the broadest attacks on First Amendment rights in schools and universities that this country has seen in generations. But looking at what's happening in book banning right now, the number of public school book bans across the country has increased by 33% in the last school year. That's compared to the 2021-22 school year. And perhaps unsurprisingly, a disproportionate number of those bans occurred in Florida, fully 40%. So since PEN America started tracking these book bans back in 2021, we've recorded now up to September of this year, more than 5,800 instances of books being banned. And that includes 3,300 books being banned this school year?
Yeah. So I think it's probably not quite adequate when I say that this is a problem. We might be in the crisis kind of stage, I would say here. Um, and yes, I want to make the point that we are going to be focusing on book bans today, but it is just a symptom of the larger sort of censorship wave happening in the US, which we've talked about in previous versions of this webinar monthly. Um, the thing I think is what I would like to focus on a little bit today is the kind of stories and the kind of authors that are being banned. There are often lists of the same titles that are brought up in school board meetings and library board meetings that are targeted for censorship. And they're often dealing with, tough topics like racism. They were talking about characters who have LGBTQ plus identities. And last month we did a program here about FOSTA and online censorship. And one of our speakers talked and said that we are living through a moral panic related to sex and sexuality in this moment. And so I would love to get the perspective from both of you about what you think about that. Do you think that we are sort of in a moral panic that might be feeding this? What are your thoughts? And Rob, I'll start with you.
Yes, that is unfortunate. I think we are in a situation where we're seeing a resurgent Christian nationalism that's driving a lot of these book bans and the censorship. And I've noticed, I edit a magazine here at Americans United called Church and State that we publish every month, and I also do a lot of blogging. So I'm following this issue pretty regularly. And you do notice that books with LGBTQ plus characters or themes are the most targeted. Genderqueer is the most censored book in America right now, I'm told, according to the American Library Association. And there are a number of other titles that just keep popping up over and over and over again. But this is really part of a larger strategy that reverberates in other ways. We've seen laws in states attempting to deny gender affirming care to members of the transgender community, other attempts to roll back LGBTQ plus rights, bans on drag shows, things like that. So this sort of Christian nationalist crusade, and I do think that's an appropriate term to use, it has many features. The book banning aspect of it is one, and is certainly one of the most troubling and one of the most visible right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk more about that term Christian nationalism in our next question. But before I go there, Nadine, what do you think about this moral panic at the moment?
I think it's an apt phrase. If you look at what we're seeing in terms of these bans, it has been consistent from the beginning of our tracking that the vast majority of the books that are banned do have to do, as you pointed out, Mandy, with issues of race, issues of racism, but characters of color who are the protagonists or important secondary characters, LGBTQ plus themes, LGBTQ plus identities. It's a consistent thing that we're seeing, and 75% of the books that were banned in this past school year were young adult books. So they really are targeting these young adult middle grade chapter books, or even picture books. The books are written for younger audiences, and they are the vast majority of them targeted toward these topics and themes.
Yeah. I know one of my favorite banned books, which is also on this list, is George M. Johnson's All Boys Aren't Blue, which deals with all of those topics head on, I think in a beautiful way for young people. That's just my perspective. So let's talk about that big term, Christian nationalism. Rob, can you break that down for our viewers a little bit for folks who might not be familiar exactly with what that means? What does that mean in very basic terms?
Yes, this is a term that has come into vogue in the last few years. I think it's a good term, but it's not a new phenomenon. You can go back to the founding period and see accounts and read accounts of people who are angry, for example, that the Constitution doesn't contain any references to Christianity or God or Jesus, people who believe that we should have formally been created as a Christian nation. That didn't happen, of course. So this idea of Christian nationalism, it has resurfaced at various points in our history. very powerful prior to the Civil War and powerful again after the Civil War. Went into a period of decline and rose up again in the 20s. Of course, the rise of the religious right in the late 1970s and the moral majority and the election of Ronald Reagan in '80 and so on, another powerful period for this movement. Essentially, Christian nationalists are people who believe that a particular version of Christianity, and I want to stress that because we're talking about a very fundamentalist, extremely conservative version of Christianity, wedded to ultra conservative politics, should basically rule over all of us. This would exclude millions of Christians in America. So people shouldn't hear that term and think, oh, that's okay. If they're a Christian, they don't have to worry about it. It's a very fundamentalist type of Christianity. They would wed this to the power of the state, and essentially, as much as they could, and I hope some people aren't shocked by this, I think this is a true statement, move us as close to a theocracy as they can.
Yeah. So it's everybody sort of united behind this one idea, their belief, and pushing it on all of us. You know, to really boil it down, right? And in this instance, it's one particular section of Christian belief. Um, and are there any warning signs? You know, you referenced a couple different points in history where we've seen these movements be powerful and have a lot of influence. But you know, here in 2023, what are the warning signs that we should look for, that we could see, like, oh, this influence is really starting to take hold here?
Right. Well, we've already blown by a couple of those posts. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, the attempts to undermine legal abortion in America, to the extent that some states are now considering laws that would punish anyone who helps a woman leave the state to get a legal procedure elsewhere. Really just extreme kind of laws that are clearly based on religion. You know, the Supreme Court at one time had embraced the standard in this country that laws had to have a secular purpose. Well, they tossed that out a couple of years ago. And that leaves us in a very difficult position because our laws aren't supposed to be based on religion or someone's interpretation of the Bible. Yet we're seeing that. So that's one really strong warning sign right there. When people are openly talking about basing our laws on someone's understanding of the Bible or a statement by a religious leader or some other type of religious basis, we really need to be concerned. A lot of times when these books are being banned in communities, people don't even try to hide their religious agenda. They'll stand up at school board meetings and say, this offends the Bible, or this offends my religion, or my pastor tells me this book is evil. And they don't even attempt to have a secular reason for banning the book. They just go after it. So that is a really strong warning sign right there, and it's staring us in the face.
Yeah, and for the groups or the folks who are not so blatant about their beliefs, and their motivations, is there any sort of coded language or words that these movements like to use, or what are they calling themselves?
Yeah, I think a lot of what you hear is family. You hear that word a lot. Family values, protect the children. Uh, these are the types of terms that people throw around a lot. They'll talk about children like they're trying to, protect children from being exposed to some ideas they think are threatening. But really, what they're trying to do is elevate ignorance and to deny some children the right to see themselves represented in literature and in history and in books. And that's just very alarming.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, here at Woodhull, we talk about that phrase "protect the children" all the time because it's often used related to any sort of sexual content, even if it's not explicit, even if it's sex education. You know, one of the bills that Woodhull's been working really hard to advocate against is called the Kids Online Safety Act, which is all about protecting the children. And really would cause quite a bit of censorship. And so, yeah, that's definitely coded words. And I think, family is, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't define family, right? And so the fact that this movement has sort of co-opted that word and decided to tell us or to define family for themselves is really quite disappointing.
Absolutely. And one of the things I find most distressing is that you find people who don't want to acknowledge reality. LGBTQ people exist. They're part of our world. They don't have to be in a closet anymore. People have sex before marriage. That's a reality. We have to prepare our children to live in the world as it is, not as some religious zealots would like it to be.
I would say, Mandy, I think about this as well in terms of the use of the phrase parental rights or parents' rights. We see that happening quite a bit in the book banning sphere, where they say, well, we're just coming forward to ensure that parents' rights are being met. And that's really a euphemism, because there are plenty of parents, in fact, more parents you'll find in the public school system who are against the idea of book banning, who do not want to see these materials removed from the shelves. And so instead of actually having true parental rights, what you're seeing is a co-opting of not only the phrase, but also the authority and professionalism of librarians, the educators, others who are tasked with ensuring access to material and placing that viewpoint on an entire community.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nadine, for bringing us, well, both of you for bringing us to this point, because, one of the things that I think was missed in Florida when the Don't Say Gay bill was passed was, I'm going to call this a missed opportunity for activists. The branding of the bill as a Don't Say Gay bill, I think actually did us a disservice, because there's a lot in that bill that's not just about LGBTQ content, not just about sex. And we're not talking about the real issue, which is that, there's been many interviews I've watched with Governor DeSantis, where he just beats this drum of parental rights over and over and over again. And one of the questions that comes up for me in all of that is, what about the students, right? Like, where are their rights in all of this? Like, I know that people under the age of 18 do not have the same rights. Obviously, they are not adults, but they still have a right to access information. They still have First Amendment free speech rights. And so these parental rights bills are really concerning on a number of levels. But that's one of the things that comes up for me is students and the children who are living in states with these really restrictive laws now. So we're talking about book bans today, and we've kind of started to zoom out our conversation already, which is wonderful. I love when that just naturally happens. But it's our belief here that book bans are really a symptom of a larger movement to repress our human rights and sexual expression, which you both mentioned, with things like abortion bans, bans on gender affirming care. So I'm wondering, Rob, I asked you to tell us a little bit about history, but could you tell us a little bit about right now here in the US? Are there other places we haven't discussed where Christian nationalism is advancing, or other places you're seeing this movement gain a lot of prevalence?
Yes, we are in a period where Christian nationalism is undergoing a bit of a resurgence. And we see examples of that playing out politically in many different ways. In some states, there are attempts to roll back LGBTQ rights. There are constant attacks on reproductive freedom alongside the book bans and other types of issues that we're seeing. Now, folks who are specialists in political science and the political system will know more about this than I do. But, there's a section of the conservative base that really rallies around these red meat issues. But there is also a larger segment of our population that's very worried about them, and they don't always play well with the larger population. I was just reading a story recently from Minnesota, where a woman demanded the removal of the book Genderqueer from the public library. And the result was that a bunch of people flooded this meeting to say that they were opposed to book banning and they wouldn't stand for this. And the library board voted unanimously to keep the title. So there are instances where people just stand up, get vocal, and make their views known. We can win, but even in conservative areas sometimes. But I sometimes worry that folks are not aware of the scope of this problem right now.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, that's an excellent actually segue into our next question, which is about turning the tide, right? An important part of these conversations we're having here at Woodhull is giving folks the tools to do exactly what those folks in Minnesota did. Rob. So, each of your organizations are fighting against censorship in their own way. And I'd love to hear more about it and tell our audience um, what some of the strategies or tactics that they can incorporate to fight against these book bans. So, Nadine, let's start with you. What are some of your thoughts and ideas?
So the first thing we encourage people to do is to know what's happening in their own communities, actually, right to Rob's point, because these things are happening at the local level, right? These are at school board meetings, it's happening right in folks' backyards. And it's really critical that people are aware as to what's going on. Obviously, we would say read our materials, but it's really more about being aware and understanding what is happening, and then recognizing the power of your own voice, right? Recognizing that everyone has a role to play in their community and should be able to stand up for what it is that they want to see and that they want to do. We've actually, in our research now, we've been very heartened by the fact that the youth resistance to book bans is really rising. In a number of school districts across the country, we're seeing protests, we're seeing folks speaking out at school board meetings, and we're even seeing the establishment of these national organizations that are dedicated to defending access to literature in schools. And that goes back to your point, Mandy, about the rights of students. We talk about here the right to the freedom to read. It's critically important that we recognize that the people we should be talking about are the students, right? Are those who are trying to have access to these materials. And of course, the Rogers organization want to mention the authors, the illustrators, the translators, whose works have been removed, and to the detriment of those individuals, as well as the students who should have the access.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a number of, I know, recent lawsuits. I think one of which Penn is a part of in Florida, with a number of authors and publishers who are standing up, taking them to court, and showing these censorship folks who's who.
Yes, exactly. We are.
Yeah,
I think
it's great.
we are the lead plaintiff in a case in Escambia County, Florida, and we are very very honored to be joined by 5 authors, by parents on behalf of themselves and their minor children, and by Penguin Random House. So really trying to talk here about the baseline here, the constitutional rights that are at issue, and how critical it is to uphold those rights.
Yeah. Well, Rob, what are your thoughts? And maybe you can give us a little bit of a historical perspective as well, in terms of how folks have fought back against these kind of Christian nationalist forces, and what folks can do today.
Yeah, I do think the litigation is important, and I was pleased to read about the Penn lawsuit, and also pleased to hear some high-profile authors speaking out, people who have great popularity and credibility. I think that really helps. It helps the average American realize what's at stake here. So that's important. I really like to see us get on the offensive more. We've been on the defensive for a while. And I think it's time to be a little more aggressive. One of the things I noticed was that in Illinois, they passed a law designed to make it harder to ban books. So they're taking a stand that's a lot different from what you're seeing in some other states where they're trying to ban these books. So let's see more of that. Also, one of the things I'd like for people to explore is the possibility of direct democracy through ballot initiatives. Think about what happened since Roe v. Wade was overturned. Voters in 5 states went to the ballot and they supported abortion rights, and Ohio may join them in November. So maybe there are other issues that we could bring to the ballot, touching on this issue and others, that would be worth exploring. Get a little bit on the offensive out there, and try some of these things instead of always being in a defensive mode. I think that would really help us. So we're working to try to help folks understand the importance of that. But what Nadine said about local matters is very important. People need to know who's sitting on your school board. Is there a library board? Who's sitting on that board? How do you get on it? Who does it answer to? Who's on your county commission? Who's on your city council? These things can vary depending on what part of the country you're in, but just that kind of basic information is a good place to start, because those are the folks you're going to be interacting with as you try to put some steel in their spine so they'll stand up to these censorship efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, because a lot of this is happening at the very local level. And I think, what folks fail to realize is Moms for Liberty, which is an organization that has been really successful in pushing these book bans, started out very small. And I believe in order to be a chapter of Moms for Liberty, you only need about 10 people. So I was always amazed that these efforts were oftentimes one or two people, taking the time to show up at a school board meeting and getting really loud about it, even though they weren't in the majority of what their community might think. Um, and I'll also say that most of these meetings are on Zoom now. So folks don't always have to even leave their homes to go to them, which is really helpful. So yeah, thank you for both that information. And I will give you both a plug, because I think if folks want to learn more and get that information, as you said, that's so important, Nadine, PEN America is a great resource, as well as Americans United. Rob, you mentioned that you blog about these issues. I read both of your newsletters. That's where I get a lot of my information. So folks should definitely check those out. Um, let's look forward for a second. And let's talk about what both of you might see on the horizon in terms of not only book bans, but censorship in general. We talked, one of you mentioned at the top of the program that censorship is cyclical, right? Like we've been here before where book bans were a thing and other censorship efforts. So where do you see us heading in the next couple of years? Do you see some efforts at the local level, federal level, legislatively? What are your thoughts about what's kind of coming next in terms of censorship? And Nadine, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I do think I think the cycle is something that we need to be aware of, because if you look at history in this country in particular, we have had these cycles of censorship. It happened in the late 70s and early 80s. It happened in the 50s and 60s. Happened in the 20s and 30s. I mean, it's something that continues to happen. But what actually gives me hope in that fact is that every single time the First Amendment has won out, right? And so I think we will get there again. But I think we have to recognize now that we are in somewhat of a different era. For one thing, as you mentioned, Mandy, we're on Zoom, right? This is the age of the internet, and so much of the bans that happened really got their start by people sharing lists online and Facebook groups and what have you, and making that movement happen in that way. The other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, and so many of the books that we're seeing banned now are the young adult books. That wasn't a category before, and so now there is this more of a focus as to this idea that there should be certain controls about what students are reading, that should come from one or two individuals in a community, as you note, and then placing that ban over the entire community. So I do see this. I see it continuing to grow to some extent, but I also am seeing, as I've noted, a growing awareness as to what's happening. And I echo Rob's point about needing to be proactive on the offensive as opposed to being kind of back on our heels, and talking about the fact that this is incredibly unpopular. Some 75% of Americans are against this, right? So this is something that people can grasp onto, can understand what's happening, and can move toward. We're also seeing an increased awareness of this at the federal level. Recently, there was a hearing about book banning in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Earlier in the last Congress, there was a hearing by the House Oversight Subcommittee on the Oversight Subcommittee. I'm going to change that. I don't know what committee it was. Oversight Subcommittee. And we are now seeing, actually, this has been part of the presidential campaign, that more and more of these candidates are talking about the book banning, whether they're calling it a hoax, which it is decidedly not, or calling attention to the dire situation that is at hand. We are seeing this now rise to the level of a broader public awareness, and now even into the campaign. So I do think that as this awareness grows, as people recognize what is happening, as they see it happening with their own kids in school, not being able to access stories, not being able to see themselves in books, not being able to understand their own experiences via literature, I think we will see a turning of the tide.
Yeah, and Rob, I want to go to you in a second, but Nadine, I have a follow-up question for you, in that, we are protected by the First Amendment, right? In our constitutional rights, we should have access to this information. And Rob, you mentioned the bill in Illinois that would make it harder for folks to ban books. Is there a piece of legislation that we need to protect our books? Is there something that is not on the books already that we should be lobbying our senators for at the federal level to avoid this kind of book banning in the future? Do you think, Nadine? I don't know. I'm curious if we need that, or is the First Amendment doing enough?
It's really a great question. And as you know, Mandy, it's tricky because we are in the realm of education, which is largely governed by the states. There is a bill called the Right to Read Act that has been introduced that looks not only at protecting librarians, but also seeking to codify the language of the PICO case, which focused largely on the removal of books from the school library. And as you mentioned earlier, we know that from long time as Supreme Court jurisprudence that First Amendment rights do not stop at the schoolhouse case. So we do have a foundation there. And I think that we could continue to see efforts to ensure that there is some kind of codification of protection vis-a-vis the First Amendment rights that we wish to see more fully enshrined in legislation. But I also recognize that at the federal level, they are bumping up against the concerns about wanting to ensure that there is this right that adheres to the states. And so it's almost about stopping the bills that are seeking to censor more, which we've seen plenty of those all across the country, and less about trying to place another layer of legislation at the federal level.
Sure. All right. So yeah, I think that's a great point. We probably should not need any additional federal legislation. Nadine, do we know anything at this moment about what has been able to actually happen at the local level? And do we have any numbers about what's happened so far?
Yes, and actually, I think this is a really critical point in terms of talking about what we see happening and what could be coming next. This movement has grown from, as you've noted, Mandy, from a few community members and now it's into these groups that you've mentioned and then into state legislation. And what's really shocking is, I think, what we've seen in this past school year, which is that 86% of the book bans that happened in this past school year occurred in school districts where there is a nearby chapter of one of these groups that you've mentioned: Moms for Liberty, Citizens Defending Freedom, Parents' Rights in Education. We're talking about 2,902 bans that happened in this country in an area that had a chapter of one of those organizations. And that also means that 63% of the bans occurred in 8 states that had legislation that either directly facilitated those bans or created the conditions for those local groups to pressure and intimidate educators and librarians into removing books. So we really are seeing the power of what's happening at the local level. And what that means is there's an incredible opportunity to push back at the local level as well. And because as we've noted, this is not something that is popular. And when you hear the pushback about it, oftentimes you will hear, oh, it's not real, it's a hoax, that kind of thing. Or you will hear, as Rob talked about earlier, that they're changing the narrative about it and focusing on particular sexual content, when in fact what we're actually talking about is wholesale banning of having to do with all kinds of issues, largely focused on LGBTQ plus identities, issues of race, issues of racism. So it's happening consistently and the narrative is shifting, and there's an incredible opportunity here to grasp that narrative and turn it the other way.
And I would hazard a guess that those 8 states are probably also states that have things like abortion bans and bans on gender affirming care. It's just a guess, but these bans and censorship is not happening in a vacuum, which I think we've sort of illustrated during our conversation today. And thank you for sharing that. That is, that's a startling and disappointing statistic, but also obviously lots of room for opportunity for us to fight back there. All right, so Rob, I'm going to take it back to my initial question before we went down our little path there. But what do you see from your perspective? What do you see on the horizons for censorship in the U.S.? What do you anticipate coming our way?
What I hope to see is a continuation of something that's already underway, and that is the creation of a united front of lots of different organizations with an understanding of the importance of intersectionality to stand up to these book bans. Yeah, I've been telling people for some years now that book bans are a church-state separation issue because they're often based on someone's religious beliefs. The LGBTQ plus community, I think, is energized because they're seeing that it's books with those themes that are being targeted. Groups that work on issues of racial justice are seeing that these books that deal with facets of American history that are important that we face, but that some people find uncomfortable, those books are being targeted. They need to be involved in this coalition. Women's rights groups, because you have books that have attacked feminism, books that have discussed feminism being attacked, they need to be involved in this discussion. Even allies that may seem a little unusual, like scientific community, because a lot of times books that may discuss evolution or certain scientific topics are under attack. So the creation of that sort of united front of lots of different people standing up and just making it clear that they won't accept this anymore. That is something I'm seeing happening now. And if that continues, I think it will be a very powerful force in the future.
Yeah. Another unlikely ally is, maybe a sexual freedom organization like Woodhull Freedom Foundation, sort of jumping in because censorship is not okay anywhere, is our belief. And in addition to these being First Amendment violations, I should have mentioned this earlier. Censorship is a human rights violation. There are 3 articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that deal directly with censorship. And that's been around since 1948. So, it's important for us, I think, to frame this issue as having multiple consequences beyond just removing books from libraries. So thank you all for that information. We've talked, and Nadine, you referenced that young adult was not a category historically, right, in literature. And a lot of this is happening in schools. It is being targeted towards students and kids. But I'm wondering if you all have thoughts for adults, adults who don't have children, right? Folks who are maybe not reading YA, or they're not necessarily worried about what kids are able to get in libraries. How might they best support this movement? What do you think, Rob?
Well, you've put your finger on, I think, a very important issue there. And it's one that affects society in other ways. Folks need to realize that just because they may not personally be affected by the violation of someone else's rights, that still harms us as a society. There is a reason why we all pay taxes to support public education, even if our children are grown or we never had children. There's a reason why we all pay taxes to support a public library, even if maybe we don't use it or we buy our books from a bookstore. There are certain things that are a public good. They lift up our society and they make us better as a nation. So the first challenge, I think, is to help folks understand that just because you're not being affected doesn't mean it isn't a serious issue. If the rights of young people are being violated, well, those are the young people who are going to be running our society someday, and they're going to be in charge of things. We want them to be educated. We want them to understand these issues. So don't have this selfish attitude. Understand that we're all in this together. So we can kind of make an argument like that as much as we can. I think that is extremely important because sometimes we get into these periods of kind of siloing in this country or selfish behavior, and people think they don't have to care. Well, they do have to care.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Nadine, any thoughts on that?
I wholeheartedly +1 everything that Rob just said, and I would just add, if you look at this in terms of what's being removed from the classroom, whether that's in a school library, a classroom library, or in a curriculum, what we're seeing here is an effort to erase parts of history, to erase identities, to erase an understanding of what has come before and what exists now. And not only is it important, as Rob noted, to ensure that students are educated, but it's important to educate them about the world they are about to inherit, the world into which they will graduate. Understanding not only being able to see themselves, as I noted, in these books, but also understanding the experiences of others, developing empathy. These are traits we want in our children. We should want in our children. We should want that in our society. And supporting the educators, the librarians, the parents, the authors, the students who are threatened by this, whose speech is being chilled, whose access to information is being prevented, is critically important again for the continuation and the growth of our democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we haven't really talked about the librarians too much in our discussion today, but um, librarians are rock stars, in my opinion. And one of the side effects that I've noticed of these book bans is it's not just the removal of books that is happening. This sort of like I don't always like to use this term, but this like war on books has extended into our libraries and into our schools. We've seen bills that want to defund libraries. We've seen bills that want to criminalize librarians for putting this kind of content in their libraries. And so I think, I want to make sure we make that point in that it's not just the removal of books from shelves, just like it's not only affecting youth or, parents, like you both just said. And librarians are kind of on the front lines in all of this, in protecting literacy and our freedom to read. So they're great folks to take your cues from too. If you're not sure how to best advocate for book bans, I'm sure your local librarian would have a lot of thoughts if anyone, were to ask them. So, I want to thank you both for being here today. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. Our goal with this conversation was to dive in a little bit to what's actually causing these book bans, not just, hey, book bans are happening and that's a problem. And so before we wrap up today, I would love to just ask each of you, to share any sort of words of wisdom or any thoughts that we haven't covered today about this issue before I let you both go. And Rob, I'll start with you.
A couple times during this conversation, I've mentioned history, and I really think it's instructive. We can learn from history. And I would just challenge folks to think back about what would have happened in the past if the book banners had had their way. We would have been denied John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. We would be denied Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, the works of J.D. Salinger, so many other famous authors whose works are considered classic today that are part of the literary canon would have been denied to us because somebody thought, we shouldn't be exposed to this material. We can't let that happen. So learn the lesson of history, bring those lessons forward into the world today, and understand that, as we've said many times during this discussion, this is a cyclic thing, but we've defeated it in the past. We can do so again.
Yeah. Nadine, what are your thoughts?
Actually, I was also thinking about history, but also looking at it from the perspective of what has happened in other countries from which we can learn. Educational censorship and book bans are a long-standing tactic of oppressive regimes. We saw apartheid South Africa banning books. We have seen Iran ban the study of English in primary school. We've seen Hungary banning curriculum referencing homosexuality from all of its schools. Russian laws, Turkish laws, it goes on. And I think it's critically important for us to recognize that all of this might seem like it's not affecting a swath of, a huge swath of people. It might not be happening in one's community. Some of our audience members may not be experiencing this. But I do think it's important for us to recognize the perspective and to understand that when we chip away at these rights and we don't do anything about it, then we are letting that foundation crumble. And it's really incumbent upon us to try to stop that from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share a tidbit that I learned in a book recently. Octavia Butler, in her Exogenesis series, her main character Lilith, the characters that take her over will not let her have a pen and paper. It's the one thing they won't let her have. And I think there are a myriad of examples from books where our characters have not been given the power that comes with reading and information and education. So excellent points to the both of you. So where can folks learn about your work? Where can they follow you if they, got a little taste of something really interesting today? Where can they follow up with you? Rob, I'll start with you.
Yes, well, our website is very simple. It's au.org, so letter A, letter U.org. And from there, you will find portals to all of our social media feeds, our blog, the magazine I mentioned that I edit. It's all there. So folks can just go to au.org and take it from there.
Yeah. And Nadine.
We have a similarly simple website. It's pen.org, pen.org. From there, you can see links to our reports, links to materials for librarians, for students, for others who are interested in being able not only to protect themselves, but also to address these concerns. And we are on all the major social media channels, so please come follow us.
Yes, and folks, I will be sending you all a follow-up email with those links, so you don't need to jot all that down right now. I will send it to you along with some other really wonderful book banning resources. So again, thank you both so much for your time, lending your expertise. I really appreciate this conversation, and thanks to our attendees for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. I really learned so much in our conversation with Nadine and Rob, and I'm feeling like real fired up to fight book bans, which I hope all of you are feeling that way too. So just a reminder, this is a monthly series. We will be back in October with our next installment. And it's not totally finished yet, but I think we're going to be tackling art and censorship. So it should be pretty interesting. Stay tuned to our website, woodhullfoundation.org, or any of our social media pages. Our handle is Woodhull Freedom on all platforms. If you learned something today, or you, like me, are also feeling fired up, you can head on over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate and make a contribution to our programming. Our program is always free and accessible because we believe in giving you all the information you need to protect and defend sexual freedom. But we can't do that without your support. So woodhullfoundation.org/donate, and we would appreciate any contribution you might have. So thanks again for being here, and I'll see you next month.